fundamentally change things is with Donald Trump out of the White House. Not a joke. You will see an epiphany occur among many of my Republican friends. And it's already beginning this year in the House now. You've seen people that, in fact, were not willing to vote for any Democratic initiative, even if they agreed with it, because they didn't want to be the odd person out of it. It wasn't going to pass. There's no sense in getting politically beaten for something that's not going to happen. But you're seeing the talk, even the dialogue is changing.
Welcome back to AM Joy. I'm Maria Teresa Kumar. Last year, Joe Biden struck quite an optimistic tone on the campaign trail. But if the Republicans in the Senate are going to have an epiphany, they better hurry up. When the president-elect takes office in January, he is going to inherit an economy in tatters and millions of Americans in desperate need of a second COVID relief bill. In 2009, when Biden and President Obama faced a similar landscape, they were able to pass the Recovery Act, which ultimately kicked off the longest period of economic growth and job creation in American history. But then there were 57 Democratic senators, 2 independents, and 41 Republicans. All the Democrats and one of the independent senators voted for the bill, but so did 3 Republicans who crossed the party line. Fast forward 12 years later, the economic crisis is even worse. That is when President Obama recently explained passing a stimulus bill this year won't be so easy.
Right now, we've got 2 seats in Georgia coming up. If the Republicans win those 2 seats, then Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will not be able to get any law passed that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans aren't willing to go along with.
Joey now is Robert Reich, former labor secretary under President Clinton and the author of The System. Secretary Reich, I'm so pleased to have you join me because I think that you have been sounding this alarm of desperate inequity in our country long before the COVID pandemic exposed how vulnerable we really are. Can you speak to where we are and how we can actually address some of these issues today?
Well, we're having a perfect storm in the next couple of months because not only do you have about a third of Americans who are behind on their mortgage or their rent payments, but you also have an enormous number of Americans who are unemployed or who are worried about becoming unemployed. First-time claims for unemployment insurance are now growing. Once again, I think there's a very strong case and a very strong chance that we're going into a double-dip recession because simply COVID is increasing. So you've got all of these things happening just exactly at the same time that the last of the federal benefits are running out with regard to unemployment insurance and debt relief. So this is going to be, sadly, a not terribly Merry Christmas. I'm particularly worried about this period between Christmas and Inauguration Day. If Joe Biden can very, very quickly move, and if both seats in Georgia do flip to the Democrats, it's one thing. But if it's very hard for him to move, if the Republicans make it very, very difficult for him, and we are in the kind of economic crisis I fear we're going to be in, then millions and millions of Americans are going to be in terrible, terrible state.
Secretary Reich, the perfect storm that you're describing really seems to parallel FDR when he was governing. What can we learn from those lessons, and what can we advise, as you're a former labor secretary, what would you advise Joe Biden?
Well, in 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt took over, the public not only was in dire straits, but knew it was in dire straits, and the entire Congress had flipped over to being Democrat and wanted to do something. The country, there was no question in the country that something dramatic had to be done. The difference today is although the economy is in very difficult straits and many, many millions of people are very, very hard up, either because of the economy or because COVID or some combination of the two, you don't have quite that unity politically behind the new president. You also have a president that his hands are tied because, you see, the Senate is so critical. We haven't really talked about Mitch McConnell, but Mitch McConnell becomes a very central person here if those 2 Georgia seats don't flip. And Mitch McConnell has not shown any indication of a willingness to cooperate with the new president. In fact, Mitch McConnell is the same old Mitch McConnell. I mean, Mitch McConnell, starting from when Barack Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell said at that time, I want to make sure he's a one-term president. And Mitch McConnell since then has not done anything to help any Democrat, certainly not any Democrat, certainly not Obama. He has given every indication he's going to give Joe Biden a very, very hard time.
So, as a former labor secretary, what are the abilities that Biden has at his disposal? There's a lot of talk about using his executive privileges, executive orders to bypass the Senate. We know that Trump implemented a lot of this by reallocating funding, for example, from the Pentagon to build the wall. What does he have in his arsenal to combat a Senate that you have shared and is widespread belief it refuses to engage in a bipartisan way for the American people?
Well, there are a number of things that Joe Biden could do, even independent of the Senate or independent of Congress. Number one, student loan debt, particularly federal student loan debt. He could, by executive order, just eliminate almost all of that federal student loan debt. He could also make it easier to form labor unions. He could, to some extent, raise the minimum wage. That might be a little tricky with Congress, but there are ways through executive orders and regulations he might be able to do that. Through Labor Department regulations, he could make it, he could reduce the threshold over which people are entitled to overtime pay. And that also would stimulate the economy. In other words, his hands are not completely tied. There are a lot of things that Joe Biden could do even with an uncooperative Senate.
And I want to bring in the rest of our guests. Secretary, thank you for joining us. We're also bringing in Tara Dowdell, president of the Tara Dowdell Group, Anand Girdales, author and publisher of The Ink, and Paula Ramos, former deputy director of Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton. Thank you all for joining. And Anand, I want to start with you, because one of the things that you have declared very evenly is how our tax bracket is just not fair. And what we're seeing right now under COVID is a lot of billionaires and people earning a lot of money leaving states with high income tax and going to places that have lower income tax. But the Federal Reserve is literally teetering. Is looking at taxation one of the first policy issues that Biden should look at?
It is, but that, to go back to your previous discussion, is one of those things that does involve Congress, obviously. I think before we even get to the tactical question of what Biden can do, we have to get to the moral and spiritual question of what he wants to do, of what he has the gall to do. Because this is a country awash in pain right now, as you know, and the pain should be the starting point of the conversation. And I would say for a very long time, Democrats, too many Democrats, have used Mitch McConnell as an alibi when charged with economic assault and political negligence. There's no question that the Republicans and Mitch McConnell have obstructed a lot of things. But as the secretary just said, there's a whole bunch of things you can do, including wiping out federal student debt. Do you imagine the effects that would have on millions of people? You can do stuff on the environment. You can do stuff on labor rules. There's a day one agenda published by the American Prospect that folks should look at. But I think the spiritual question of, does someone like Joe Biden, who radiates personal decency and who has made personal decency the lodestar of the campaign, is he willing to fight for structural decency? Because unfortunately, personal decency actually doesn't get rid of anybody's medical debt, doesn't actually get anybody relief from the many overlapping sources of pain. And I had an interview in The Ink with Chuck Schumer right on the eve of the election, in which he laid out a bunch of the FDR style things he would like Biden to do with a favorable Congress. But he also laid out some of the things that could be done without. And Schumer, in this interview, who is very much like Biden temperamentally, cautious, institutionalist, a moderate, in this interview, Schumer was critical of the Democratic Party over the last generation, saying we were not bold enough in the Obama years, the Clinton years. We need to be bolder. We need to be more like that FDR spirit. I encourage everybody to go to the.ink and read Chuck Schumer's words, because there is starting to be actually a break within this party from the milquetoast policies of the past and a recognition of the need for real courage in service of structural decency.
So, Tara, on that note, one of the things that Biden has promised is to forgive student loans. I was fortunate enough to have my student loans paid off finally after 15 years. But we understand what that struggle is and how it prevents so many people from moving forward. Look at this. The Wall Street Journal also said that the class of 2020 looks for work. Not since the Great Depression have so many young adults lived with their parents. In July, 52% of young adults ages 18 to 29 resided with one or both of their parents, surpassing the previous peak in 1940, according to Pew Research Center. This also is very much aligned that we saw a surge in youth vote that disproportionately voted for Joe Biden. What is his task now to address these very economic issues, preventing them from self-realizing what they would consider generations past American dream?
I agree that we certainly, as a party, the Democratic Party needs to be bolder and needs to push for bigger policies that have much more of a meaningful impact. But however, I don't think we should ever let Mitch McConnell off the hook, because some of the poorest counties in our nation are in the state of Kentucky. And Mitch McConnell is an obstructionist and actually waves a proud flag, a proud Confederate flag of being an obstructionist. But I do think there's some things that can be done that I'd like to add to the table and to the conversation around what the federal government can do without a Senate control. And one of the things that people forget is that, and I'm a small business owner, the federal government, the United States federal government, is the single largest purchaser of goods and services in the world. And what that means is that we can open up the spigots to ensure that small businesses, Black-owned businesses, brown-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, small businesses in some of the hardest hit communities in this country can have access to those resources. And it's within our power to do that. Right now, we're working with Governor Murphy, a very progressive administration, to market and do outreach for his grants that are going to small businesses. And I can tell you, they are suffering, they are struggling. And what that means for communities is an empty storefront is more crime. An empty storefront, it's fewer jobs. An empty storefront is more social dislocation in communities that have been hard hit. So while I know other people here will talk about the impact on individuals, so I want to bring the small businesses to the forefront and to the table. And so one of the things that we can do is reverse the things that Trump has done to stop Black and brown-owned businesses from having equal access to opportunities and contracts. One of the things we can do is to ensure that when these big companies like Amazon become so powerful that they're not writing our laws, that's another thing that can be done. And what people can do, the public can do, because I worked in government too before I started my business, is the public needs to put pressure. The marching doesn't stop. The marching must continue. The pressure must continue, because the change has to come from within and without.
And I want to underscore that, because folks take for granted that there was such a surge in voting because of a lot of the inequities that candidates like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Julian Castro discussed the inequities that we see and the need for massive change, almost a reset of America. And that was before COVID hit. Paola, you traveled the country for your book, Finding Latinx. Speak to what you saw, how those themes actually translated into the American geist in order to actually vote for Joe Biden. And are the Democrats now on the hook to think just as audaciously as a generation past?
Of course. So when young people went to the polls, particularly young people of color, they voted with a couple of things in mind, right? And keep in mind that it is millennials and Gen Zers who have been suffering the most from this economic recession that we're going through. But when young people of color voted, they voted with racism on their mind, with social justice on their mind, and with COVID-19 on their mind. That took priority over the economy. And that is because young people, when they look at the America that we're living in right now, when they look at 55 million living in poverty, millions of people living in food insecurity, that people under 20 and 24 years old are facing the highest unemployment rate compared to any other age group. When young people look at that America, they understand that the root of the problem isn't just a Band-Aid policy. No, it's not just one set of policy solutions. It is structural racism. It is that people understand that they need to reimagine what the economy looks like. And let's not forget that it is young people who voted for Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders didn't necessarily propose revolutionary ideas. It was ideas that seemed right for them and it was realistic for them. So I think, to me, that is the most important thing that Joe Biden is up against, is understanding the economy and this America through the eyes of young people, because that is the future at the end of the day of this country.
Well, and Paola, we know that the Generation Z is actually going to be the largest population of eligible voters soon, and the generation behind them is even larger. And so, Secretary Reich, I want to share this tweet from Bernie Sanders about the wealth divide, shrinking middle class. Since 1990, there has been a massive transfer of wealth from workers to the people on top, while the 1% have seen their wealth go up by $22 trillion. The bottom 50% of Americans have seen their wealth go down by $776 billion. We need a strong middle class, not an oligarchy. I want to get your take on this because there is going to be, I believe, a big pull within the Democratic Party of, do we go incrementally or do we go big? What is your take?
Well, I feel very strongly that we have to go as big as we possibly can. The middle class has been shrinking. In fact, if we had the same distribution of income we had in the 3 decades after the Second World War, the typical American worker would not be earning $38,000 or $40,000 a year. The typical American worker would be earning $60,000 to $80,000 a year. If we had the same distribution of income we had in the first 3 decades after the Second World War, we would have a much, much larger and more buoyant and growing middle class instead of a shrinking middle class. What we find, many people, and I hear it all the time in the media, that people say, well, we want to go back to where we were before Donald Trump. That would be a terrible mistake, because where we were before Donald Trump, that is a return to that so-called normal, got us Donald Trump. In other words, we were on the road toward Donald Trump in terms of stagnant incomes, widening inequality, corruption, a kind of institutional and structural racism. If we don't actually change the road we were on, if we don't fundamentally reverse and alter the kind of underlying problems we were facing before Trump, we're going to find Trumps as far as the eye can see, and we're also going to have environmental and racial and other crises as far as the eye can see. This is the central dilemma of Joe Biden's time, because people are exhausted, they are divided, they want quiet after Donald Trump, they simply want to go back to the way things were, but Joe Biden cannot afford that degree of complacency. He doesn't want and should not want to take people back to where they were before.
And Secretary, I am with you 100%. Let's not forget, for communities of color, before wasn't so great. But they are the rising electorate in the United States, and they are hungry for change, and that is why they voted for Biden. And we need to think audaciously, just like a generation 100 years ago did so. They were the great generation. And what you are encouraging us, each of our panelists, is for America to rethink audaciously and think big again, like we did in the past. Thank you, Robert, Tara, and Anand. Paola will be back in a moment with us. Coming up, New York City mayoral candidate Maya Wiley is here to discuss the Supreme Court ruling on religious freedom and the coronavirus. We'll be right back.